Well, depending on where you are watching this, I'm going to say good evening or good afternoon. My name is Beth Kegel. I'm Vice President and Director of Smart and Connected Solutions for HNTB Corporation. And HNTB is a transportation infrastructure firm serving both public and private sector owners. We offer a wide range of services, including planning, design, and program and construction management. And in my role, I feel like I'm the luckiest of all because I get to work with transportation agencies, cities, and regions in leveraging mobility innovations to develop smart and connected infrastructure solutions. But related to today's workshop, I'm proud to say that HNTB has a Department for Infrastructure and Mobility Equity and a corporate president, Diana Mendez, who oversees our work in this area, recognizing the importance that this has to really everyone throughout our country, and we'll hear more about it today. In addition to my role for the firm, I also serve on the steering committee of MobilityXX, which is presenting this workshop for you today. And I want to mention something, a little bit of logistics here. For today's workshop, we're going to engage you, our audience, in some polling throughout. So be on the lookout for a question that'll pop up on the screen where you'll be able to select one of the answers that you see displayed, and then we'll reveal the correct answer because it's really centered around statistics. But don't worry, your responses are anonymous. But we'd really like to get an idea of how much information that you've gotten in this space. So first, I'm going to provide you with a little bit of context. MobilityXX began as a collaboration between ITS America, the Ray, and WTS International Foundation to elevate women in transportation. Originally, this initiative was formed to be responsive to a grant opportunity that focused on putting women into decision-making roles of power. We thought, what better industry than transportation, where the lack of women at the top created such disparate outcomes for women everywhere. To learn more, oh, excuse me just a second. Apologize for that. In 2018, women made up only 15% of the transportation workforce and much less of a percentage at the decision-making levels. So why should we all care about this? Let's start by taking a look at the disadvantages that women have today regarding mobility. So first, here's an interesting statistic for you. 61% of caregivers in the US are women. So being a caregiver brings challenges when it comes to taking public transportation of any kind. So for those of you who are watching, do you think about whether you have children in tow or you're carrying packages to determine whether or not you're able to take the bus or the subway or some other mode of public transit? Also, there's safety concerns that have a significant impact too. One of the things that I learned that was very interesting is that in Los Angeles, women reported wearing running shoes on transit to run away from assailants. So let's look at an example from a survey that was done by NYU's Rudin Center on Transportation. To learn more about women's experiences while traversing New York City, they actually deployed a survey to understand their experiences with public transportation, as well as their resulting behaviors as a result of their experiences. So for those that responded, 75% of women surveyed have experienced harassment on public transit as compared to 47% of men. As a result, those that were concerned about being harassed, 54% of women are concerned about being harassed and 20% of men in this particular sampling. As a result, women will take other forms of transportation, particularly at night, to feel safe. So 42% feel safest using transportation network companies such as Uber and Lyft. 16% feel safest taking a taxi. And then there are some that will still take public transportation. What's interesting is what the Rudin Center found out is that while men's added cost as it relates to safety concerns is $0, the added cost for women ranges from $26 to $50 per month. That's actually what's known as the pink tax, where women must spend more to make the switch. So this is just one example of how women can face fewer economic opportunities because of these challenges. So how do we address these challenges? And by the way, I want to make sure you all know I am live here at the Arsenale, so you may hear a little bit of background noise from the celebrations going on in the next room, so I want to make sure you know that. So how do we address these challenges? Research suggests clear links between female leadership, broader focus on corporate social responsibility, and more equitable outcomes. One review showed that women in leadership positions and governmental organizations implement different policies than men, and that these policies are more supportive of women and children, which kind of makes sense because it's based on your own experiences. In Sweden, something very interesting here, a gender equality initiative required that towns evaluate their policies and programs through a gender lens. If you want to know what was flagged, it was snow plowing. To everyone's surprise, including the men who planned it, clearing roads before sidewalks disproportionately impacted women in this case. Women tended to walk, whereas men tended to drive. The type of trip, walking with children or a stroller or carrying groceries, also added a higher risk of injury. So swapping the order of how that plowing was done actually addressed that particular gender impact. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to put forward our first question to the audience where you're going to get to take a poll. So here's our first question. What percentage of management positions in Fortune 1000 companies are filled by women? So here are your choices, 20%, 38%, 52%. So we're going to give you a few seconds to answer those. And I'm not going to answer because I know the answer. And by the way, this is anonymous. We cannot see how you are responding, but we can see the collection of your responses. Okay, Rachel, I think we'll wrap it up. Let's see how our audience did. Okay, so 88% said 20%. Well, it's a little bit better than that. It's actually 38%. Compared to 62% of those positions are held by men. In fact, for every 100 men that get promoted to manager, only 85 women get promoted, and then the number is even less for Black women, which is 58 Black women for every 100 men that are promoted. So just some interesting statistics. This talent pipeline provides a pre-COVID-19 baseline, but the pipeline is likely to have changed during the pandemic, and you'll see why shortly. But this shows a comparison of 2015 and 2020 for all industries, and the percentage of men and women, including the percentages of those of color, holding positions that proceed from entry level all the way to the C-suite. Below that is 2020 information for the combination of transportation, logistics, and infrastructure related companies. You'll see that at some levels, those trend above all industries and in others below, particularly in the C-suite. The broken rung is a term that some of us have become very familiar with. It's the drop off beginning at that very first promotion. So you can see how those numbers pan out, which affects the ability and timing to progress to the C-suite. So that's where the challenge really begins and results in such significant gaps down the line, because then you're having to make up gaps right away. So analysts say that if we begin promoting women at the same rate as men, we actually will add 1 million women in management roles in the US in the next 5 years, as you see here on the screen. Pre-COVID, the World Economic Forum estimated that it would take 208 years to naturally reach industry gender equality unless deliberate plans and actions are taken. So I mentioned COVID impacts before. Let's take a look at those COVID impacts. So while the economy is beginning to recover, 400,000 more women have left the workforce than men. Economists estimate that employment for women may not recover to pre-pandemic levels until 2024, which is actually a full 2 years after the recovery for men. Female workforce participation has already dropped to 57%, the lowest level since 1988. That's actually according to the National Women's Law Center. From 2019 to 2020, we moved backwards. We added 55 years to the estimated time needed to close the gender gap in economic equality. Due to the imbalance of household responsibilities with the family at home during this time and work, 1.1 million workers left the workforce in September, the start of school. 80% of those were women. And now 1 in 4 women, more than 2 million, are considering leaving the workforce. So the bottom line is that COVID impacts could erase 6 years worth of progress. It's important to note that this is not about creating winners and losers. Doing so would fuel the belief that men can't thrive in tandem with women, that they must sacrifice their resources or stature for women to earn a place at the table. This is not about that at all. This is about expanding opportunities for all. And data shows that companies that are diverse outperform their peers financially. And with regards to innovation and attracting and retaining talent, this benefits all of us in the workforce. One area of focus of MobilityXX and the subject of our workshop today is the progression of companies founded or co-founded by women. Investments in these companies averaged $935,000, which is less than half the average invested in companies founded by male entrepreneurs. Despite this disparity, startups founded and co-founded by women perform better over time, generating 10% more in cumulative revenue over a 5-year period. So you can see here $730,000 compared with $662,000. So for every dollar of funding, startups founded and co-founded by women generated 78 cents over 5 years, and male-led startups generated 31 cents for every dollar of funding over that time period. So today in our panel discussion, we're going to explore this and how it fits within the mission of MobilityXX, which is to bring more diversity to our decision-making processes and leadership by empowering women to enhance economic opportunities for those that are currently at a disadvantage when using our transportation systems. The goal is to increase the percentage of women in transportation 10% in the next 10 years. So now that we've loaded you up with some statistics and some background and context, it's time to begin the dialogue. As you can see, we have an incredible panel today, and we're going to take a deeper dive in the discussion of startups and venture capital. So without further ado, I'd like to ask our panelists to please introduce themselves. And I also would like to remind our audience that you can, even though we're going to be polling you and asking questions of you, please place any questions that you have in the chat. We're going to allow some time for that as well. So let's move on. We're going to stop sharing our screen so that you can see all of us, maybe a little bit bigger here. And we'll start with Regina. Regina, could you please introduce yourself to our viewers?
Yeah, it's great to be here. Thank you so much for having me. I'm Regina Clulo, the CEO and co-founder of Populous. We're a platform for cities to manage the future of mobility. I spent most of my career dedicated to delivering solutions for sustainability and reducing the climate impacts of transportation. Populous is a smart mobility platform that puts cities in the driver's seat, delivering them with digital solutions that they need to dynamically manage their transportation infrastructure from their streets to their curbs, and from micromobility to car sharing. We, as a company, over the past 3 years, Populous has expanded to more than 80 cities around the world, from San Diego to Tel Aviv, and we're helping cities deliver a cleaner, brighter transportation future. It's great to be here and to talk a little bit more about how we can support women in transportation.
Thanks so much, Regina. We really appreciate you and your leadership for that. Jessica, how about you next?
Great to see everybody here. Beth, thank you for organizing this conversation. I'm Jessica Robinson. I'm co-founder and partner at Assembly Ventures. But I think what more accurately describes the work that I do is I'm both an investor in, but also an educator within the mobility space, as well as a champion of cities, including my adopted hometown, which is Detroit. Spent a number of years in the industry, including some household names, including Zipcar and Ford Smart Mobility. I've worked alongside a number of great entrepreneurs and founders with programs through the Techstars Corporate Accelerator. And then now as a co-founder and investor at Assembly Ventures, we are focused on the future of mobility. We're based in Detroit and also in Berlin, and are very excited about the mobility opportunities in North America and Europe. And we have a fairly broad definition. It's the physical and digital movement of people, goods, data, and energy. And of course, we're very excited about the connection to public transit as well. So I'm thrilled to be part of this discussion, including with some great women co-founders and founders in the mobility space.
Thank you so much, Jessica. Candace, how about you next?
So good afternoon, everyone. It's good to be here, and thanks for having me. My name is Candace Xie. I'm the co-founder and CEO for VO. And I started VO 4 years ago, and my general responsibility at the firm is on like partnership and policy side, HR, fundraising, and also our people and talent side. So it's pretty vast items, but I understand as the co-founder, we always cover everything. Like Regina, you might share the same. As VO, we are a Chicago-based micromobility company, and we provide share scooters and share bikes to cities across the nation. And our goal, one of them, is to provide financially sustainable and responsible programs to the community we serve, and in order to grow for a longer term. And the second goal is to provide safe, accessible, and also affordable vehicles to riders through technology innovation, especially hardware innovation. And people can find VO in cities across the nation, and soon you'll see us in New York City and also Santa Monica in July. I'm excited to be here to connect with everyone, share more, and stand together and empower women in the industry.
Thank you. Great opening remarks, Candace. We really appreciate that. And Leanne, you may be last in these opening remarks, but you're certainly not least. Very accomplished. Could you please introduce yourself?
Thank you so much, Beth, and to Regina, Candace, Jessica. I'm super excited for this conversation, in part because it's in Miami, and that's where I focus on my impact. So I serve as the president at Air Ventures. We're a venture studio that has a little bit of a different approach. We use technology, entrepreneurship, and social enterprise solutions to address systemic gaps in access and opportunity. So over the past 5 years, the ventures that we've helped support scale have served more than 55,000 innovators in South Florida. We've facilitated over 4,000 hours of entrepreneurial support and training, and partnered with about 1,200 organizations to make that happen. I'm actually a recovering attorney turned strategist, and I really focus on helping leaders and organizations develop what I call READY, racially equitable, diverse, and inclusive ecosystems around tech, innovation, and entrepreneurship, both within the confines of an organization and also within a broader community. So really excited about this conversation because Miami is one of the few American cities that was founded by a woman. And so the women's empowerment and women leadership energy runs strong and deep in our community.
Thank you so much for that, Leanne. And I'm a Miamian too, a fairly recent one. So I look forward to, I did not know that Miami was founded by a woman, and now I'll probably be telling all my friends, because that's really an interesting anecdote, well, a bit of history actually, for us to know. So we're going to move on to discussion now. And I'd like to open our discussion by getting some context from both Candace and Regina. So you both led very successful startups. All businesses from time to time do reach obstacles. What obstacles did you have to address? And did you ever get a sense that there was an obstacle out there because of gender bias? And maybe Candace, we could start with you.
Sounds good. And from my side, I would say two things is very consistent throughout the years of like working in the industry. The first is the unconscious biases. So a few years ago, I started the company with people of two. So I'm shouldering like the salesperson now and travel around like to meet our client and also meet our new hires as well. So I find out more often than not, I have experienced like our clients and also my colleagues, they naturally address questions to my male peers. And those questions should have been addressed to me directly. So the default mindset of male is working better and they have more knowledge than the woman in the room is very concerning to me. So that is one obstacle I want to call out. And the second one is the impact of the family. I will say that not in the positive way, because I would say women are usually seen as the caregiver at home. And we are more frequently to ask about our family life at work. So from my end, I need to do more persuasion in order to win trust, especially from like the VCs. Maybe Jessica, you can speak a little bit more to that. But I would say there are a lot of like unspoken things taken into consideration other than the business when they're evaluating the company. So for example, have you married? And when we will get married and who we will marry to, like we will partner, be supportive for your business. So those are not directly asked you, but I think they all take those into consideration. And I believe because of the gender bias, we usually need to prove harder to show our dedication and determination to reduce the concern of the third party or the partners we want to work with.
Thank you for that, Candace. And Regina, I'd love for you to answer this next. And by the way, all of you who are sitting on our panel, if you have something to add in response to this dialogue or as far as this dialogue, you just let me know, and we'd love to hear from you as well. So Regina, how about you next?
Yeah, sure. So I started my career in computer science, and as many folks are probably aware, that's a field where fairly consistently, over the past couple decades, women represent maybe 10% of graduates. So I'm pretty used to being surrounded by male peers and the concept of basically death by 1,000 paper cuts in the engineering female community, where your questions about your presence and whether or not you belong. So I've been told that I was only admitted to a PhD program by male peers because I'm a woman. I've been asked repeatedly by VCs, but who will build your technology? And I would say the best thing that happened to me in forming Populous was when two other companies that were led by male CEOs pivoted into my space. It was a lot easier to raise money because then my idea wasn't this crazy idea that some crazy female was pitching. It was validated by two other guys who were pitching the same idea. And all of a sudden I had my financing pretty much instantly after they had started raising. So yes, the bias is real. I think that, one of the real challenges is in that seed stage of fundraising. I was pretty strategic and focused in really trying to bring a group of diverse founders to support me. Number one, because I think that it's important to see more diverse VCs in investing, because it's part of the stepping stone to building wealth and also in seeing more financing go back into diverse founders. So my first investors included a Korean American VC, I'm half Korean, female investors that backed female founders, and then one of the few all-Black VC funds that invest in diverse founders. So I'm just really fortunate that I had male competitors that started to compete against me and validated my crazy idea, and B, really appreciate the support of diverse VCs out here in Silicon Valley.
So it's interesting that you're mentioning the makeup of your investors. I'd actually like to poll the audience for a second time here related to that. So here is our second question, which is, since the start of 2016, what percentage of venture capital deals have been received by companies with women founders? We'll give you a few seconds. 4%, 12%, 35% are your choices. Okay, Rachel, let's wrap up the poll. Okay, so evenly split between 4% and 12%. The actual number is 4.4%. So that might be interesting to you as well, to see that it was actually on the lower end of the spectrum there. So I'd like to go to Jessica next. Why do women-led startups receive such limited funding? You know, what data is out there?
How long do we have, Beth? That's such an important question. And as Candace and Regina were sharing their stories, I was reflecting on an event that I attended just last week as an investor. I have investors of my own, and I approached the venue and there were no women at the event. There were also no age peers of mine except for my co-founder. And as I was speaking to the hostess to ask which room we were going to be located in, several gentlemen elbowed their way by me to get into the event, assuming that I was a hostess. And it was after we got back in the room that they were a little embarrassed that they had just trampled over me to get to the venue. So I think it's a really important question that we raise here and a starting point. And it's you know, those lived experiences, but the data does back up some bias here as well. Investors have what is often referred to as pattern recognition. I don't know, Regina, Leanne, Candace, you've heard this before. I would say being generous, we call it unconscious bias. Looking a little bit more deeply, we call it a systemic issue. And there's really a couple things here for the types of companies we're talking about. These are high risk ventures. Most will fail. And so what investors like to do, or like to tell themselves that they do and that we do, is de-risk that. And the way historically that's been done is by working with people that look like they've been successful before. And often that's been white and male, certainly in the US, but that holds globally as well. It looks like coming from particular universities or having a particular type of track record. And so that pattern recognition, if you will, sets the stage. But Beth, you asked about data, and I think there's an interesting study that was shared just earlier this year by DocSend, and it's one of these digital tools that people use during fundraising to circulate their documents. And they took a cohort of 200 early stage companies, both pre-seed, where there's basically just an idea and a founding team, and seed, where you've started to build your technology. And they said, hey, can we look at the viewing engagement of your documents with investors? And what they found is that there's more criticism on all women teams or mixed gender teams on the problem statement and the technology in those early stages. People actually spend longer on those slides when they're viewing them. You might say, that's a good thing. But what the data shows is it's actually an early sign of skepticism, that they don't actually know what the market is that they're going after, or Regina, to your point, that they don't actually know how to build the solution. The other interesting piece of data that came out of that study is around fundraising success. Fundraising is obviously very hard, but the data in this case shows that both all female teams and mixed gender teams are duking it out with the all male teams. About 75% of those mixed gender and all female teams did have a successful raise, compared to about 80% of all male teams. But the all women teams spent longer fundraising, they took more meetings, and they raised in total fewer dollars, which most of the investors that were asked about that suggested that women founders just got fed up. And they said, we're going to take the round that we can raise and get to building our business. So the data is really mixed on this one, but it does show that in our own actions as investors, we are manifesting this pattern recognition and bias through the way that we actually view the presentations themselves.
Wow, that was a really interesting study.
I just need a comment as well. That's
Oh,
very
please,
frustrating. It's so frustrating to hear those.
Frustrating.
It's frustrating to hear those statistics. It sounds very true. I think one of the things that, you know, for all the women who want to start startups who are in the workshop, I think we need to train ourselves to do pattern recognition as well, where if we feel like there's bias happening, maybe just don't waste too much time on that investor. Don't let them give you their money.
Well, and I think that's a good lead into our next question for the audience. So if we could put that up, Rachel, please. So the venture capital industry has remained relatively uniform since 1990, but how many investors are women from a percentage standpoint? 8%, 21%, 29%. Let's see your thoughts on that. Okay, Rachel, you can wrap that one up. Let's see. Okay, 71% said 8%, and you are correct. That is the right answer. And also, it's much lower for Hispanic and Black investors. It's about 2% for Hispanic investors, and it's less than 1% for Black investors. So now I'd like to take our audience and you, our panelists, through a few steps. Let's go back to the unique mobility challenges that women have. Leanne, I'd like to go to you next. So I've heard you say, see, now you're going to know I was listening and taking notes. I have heard you say that mobility is an impediment, and I've also heard you say proximity is a challenge. Can you explain what you mean by that and how it relates to women's experiences?
Certainly. And I also want to just amplify what Jessica said, at least in terms of how we think about investing and supporting women founded companies, particularly in the mobility space. But there's additional biases, and I think a lot about framing bias and representative bias. So when you don't have women investors, particularly those that are conversant in the gov tech and transportation and mobility space, the way our brain processes information, it's not going to be able to identify those opportunities, right? It's beyond pattern recognition. I think there's about 99 cognitive biases. So that goes into this. And so when I talk about impediments and proximity, I'm thinking a lot about this idea that your lived experience and your functional experience in a particular space or with a particular group of people is what enables you to see opportunity. You know, the more time you spend with children, the more you can recognize their silent tells or some of the challenges. So when I think about proximity, I think a lot about Bryan Stevenson, who many know is the subject of that film, Just Mercy. He also wrote a book, Fellow Lawyer, and he explains that in actuality, proximity to the poor or the problem is what enables us to hear things that we won't otherwise hear and see things we won't otherwise see. How does this relate to mobility? Well, think about this. Transportation and mobility solutions are not often designed with the unique needs of women in mind. I think about Dr. Sarah Haynes, who's based in Miami, former CEO of Bolt Mobility. She explained that the way they actually designed their scooters was different because they thought about the unique needs of women. The base or the bed is wider because women sometimes wear heels or they wear skirts. And so kind of putting their legs together in a tiny little a flat piece of the bottom wouldn't work. They also created areas so your shoes wouldn't slip off. They designed them to be yellow and black because they would be more visible to minimize the chances of getting run over. And so simple things like understanding that you have to have women at the table in everything from design to building and investing helps us to think about the role of proximity. Secondly, when I talk about impediments, we have to look at what the data says. And I know we saw at the end of 2020 that the largest movement out of the workforce was women, in part because they had real responsibilities in terms of underpaid or unpaid domestic responsibilities. 75% of unpaid care work is done by women. And so there's a lack of transportation solutions designed to alleviate those associated mobility challenges relative to childcare. It's a huge industry. Think about Hop, Skip, Drive, and some other kid-friendly transportation services like Zoom, Vango, Kango, and Bubble. Like those are real market opportunities that are particularly distinct to the needs and impediments that women experience. And so impediment and proximity is not a negative framing. It's an actually understanding where there are market opportunities that can drive revenue and also meet the real needs of the majority of our population that actually uses public transportation.
Leanne, thank you so much for that. And I'm actually excited about the fact that you mentioned two people that I've had an opportunity to talk with too, Brian Stevenson and Sarah Haynes. And those were really great points that you brought up. So thank you very much for doing that, especially with Sarah now being here in Miami-Dade County as well. Thank you. I'd like to move on to Candace now. So Candace, as a designer and developer of solutions directly for the consumer, how has your diverse perspective, and maybe those of others that work within VO, how has that helped you understand, relate to, and address the needs so successfully? Because you've been very successful at it.
Thank you. And I'll share a story which is pretty related to and build on Leanne's point. I would say early days at VO and also in the industry, when stand-up scooter is the most popular micromobility vehicle type, I actually have a question about it because I don't really feel comfortable riding the stand-up scooter for a variety of reasons. For example, sometimes I went to work or go to meetings and I need to wear skirts or need to wear heels. I don't really comfortable like having my bag in my shoulder, having the heels, but standing up on those pedal boards. And I think in my doubts, it was actually validated by VO's participation in Chicago scooter pilot program like 2 years ago, because around 60% of our riders for our stand-up scooter, they are male, which is wrong to me because that shows very clear to me that we didn't serve our female riders well. For a variety of reasons. So we started to conduct research and also survey our users just to understand why they don't take stand-up scooter and how we can make it better for them in order to solve their last mile transportation issue. And last year, we were able to come out with a new product, which is our city scooter. We name it as Cosmo. And it's actually widely popular in the cities we operate in right now, especially for female riders and also for elderly. I would say the introduction of our Cosmo, it's only one example, but I would say generally speaking, women are vastly underrepresented in tech space. And I think we have a voice that can help us to bring other women in. And the same voice is also crucial when it comes to technology being created for women, because there are a lot of tech solutions that are being created for women, but not by women. And I think right now I have become perfectly comfortable working with my team saying like, this technology doesn't apply to me as a woman or as a woman of color, and you didn't include me in this solution, so we need to fix it. Even though this is not the ideal conversation to have every day, but I think we're fighting for women to be seen as equals at the ground floor of technology when it gets built.
Well, and these aren't necessarily easy conversations to have, you know, particularly in the workplace. But if you really think about it, and we think of the success rates, which I know Jessica and Leanne can attest to as well, having that dialogue and conversations about different needs and addressing them very realistically from those that have shared those experiences really bode well for everyone. Bodes well for those that are part of the company, bodes well for the public that's being served. So having those, we appreciate you, Candace, and all of you that are having those discussions. I'd like to move next to Regina. Regina, your solutions are basically tools in the toolbox, right, for public sector infrastructure and transportation providers to effectively manage their systems. Do your clients have an interest in leveraging those to meet certain equity goals? And if so, how are they doing that?
Yeah, well, so, as many folks know, transportation has a lot of inequity that's been baked into our existing infrastructure. And the cities that we work with and transportation DOT officials, they are very familiar with these challenges, I would say, for the most part. From highways that were built and ripped through communities of color to Ubers and Lyfts that now may block bike lanes and bus lanes, to the parking that we subsidize that takes up space away from pedestrians and cyclists. We find that most of our cities have a couple of key priorities that they're focused on when it comes to expanding mobility for citizens. One, safety, two, climate, transportation being one of the largest growing sources of greenhouse gas emissions, and then three, equity. And with our mobility management platform, cities are able to now very easily pull in data from vehicles. So they're able to see the real-time location information for shared scooters, mopeds, and car sharing vehicles. And then they're also able to access historical GPS trace data. There are a couple of key use cases. So some of the ways that they operationalize this data is, number one, we have a ton of cities who are updating bike master plans in order to create more safe infrastructure for micromobility, using this data faster than they would have been able to before. For those of you who've worked in transportation, you know that people would literally stand on corners and count vehicles before there were more sensors and before there was GPS enabled micromobility devices roaming around that are able to share that data more easily through us. And then specifically around equity, we do have a lot of cities who really view our platform as a two-way street. So they're pulling in data from private commercial fleets. And with our platform, they're able to design new policies that help them achieve the outcomes that they want, including ensuring that new transportation modes are actually being delivered in an equitable fashion. And so we have a lot of cities that will create distribution policies to make sure that vehicles aren't just concentrated in high income neighborhoods or central business districts, but they're actually serving low income and traditionally underserved communities. And so they're able to create those policies on our platform, communicate those policies to operators through our platform, and then validate, are we in fact achieving our goals? If not, how do we then, evaluate this data, make changes, and be able to really operate and iterate more quickly in a dynamic way with access to more tools in their toolbox.
I think that's great, Regina, because it's really positive that our localities are starting to look at equity, whether it's the challenges that women face in mobility or other underserved communities that really need that mobility connectivity. So then the question arises, are the right people looking at these challenges and helping them and supporting them to ensure that they get the outcomes that they're looking for? And so, Jessica, I'd like to ask you this question, as a funder hearing this dialogue, which I'm sure is nothing foreign to you. You probably hear this every minute of every day. But of course, through your vast experience, what are we missing if we don't include women in these mobility conversations or funding, design, public planning?
Yeah, it turns out it's a lot. I think at a bare minimum, the simple math is we're missing half of the great ideas. And as a woman in this space, I would also say we're missing half of the potential advocates in this space if we don't bring men along. So there's lots of opportunity there to make really important headway. And as a woman co-founder, I have two male co-founders, and we have conversations like this every day about, what does this mean for our organization? Where should we be mindful of these questions? But I think a really good example of what we're missing is the history of the crash test dummy. And I won't take everyone through the long history here, but it's such a poignant example for me. So I'm in Detroit, home of the automotive industry in the US. Somewhere along the way, we said, let's figure out how to make these vehicles a little bit safer. So the first crash test dummy was used in about 1971. And it took until, here's the quiz that we didn't put up on the screen, until 1996 for the first female body crash test dummy to be used in testing. But it was only in 2004 that the first female body with a fetus was used in crash test dummies. So when you think about design, but also basic things like safety, we know that if you're not considering women and women's bodies in that, there's tragic consequences. But I think we're missing so much more than that, right? It's these ideas. I think about Maya, who's a co-founder at Humanizing Autonomy. They're working to make autonomous vehicles culturally and geo-contextually aware of where they're operating, because pedestrians act different in different cities. If she weren't at the table, I'm not sure we would have too many people thinking about that technology right now. And I think women in this space in particular are also really advocating for ethical considerations around the use of autonomous driving, around the use of AI and machine learning. And again, I think that those voices would not necessarily be, or those questions would not be raised if we didn't have founders like that, investors like that at the table raising them.
Thank you so much, Jessica. And back to another question for our audience related to VCs. Approximately how many VCs have female partners? So here are your choices: 25%, 42%, 61%. I'll give you just a few seconds. Okay, Rachel, you can close the poll. 82% of you said 25%, and you're exactly right. Let me share a little bit more information with you. Approximately 12% of the decision makers in VCs are women. VC firms that increase the proportion of female partner hires by 10% saw a 1.5% on average spike in overall fund returns annually, and 9.7% profitable exits. And that's actually a lot, given the fact that only 28.8% of all exits are profitable. So they're seeing 9.7% beyond that, profitable exits. So really interesting statistics. And I know a lot of that is just because of the diversity in the decision-making and the support that's being given to the various companies. Leanne, I have a question for you related to this. You are a strategic consultancy, and you have launched a number of ventures from concept to scale. Do these results resonate with you at all? And if they do, can you share with us why?
Yeah, I think that these results represent a narrative that we all know and we're doing nothing about. And I think one of the numbers that I'd like to see, and I've yet to find the answer, is thinking from an intersectionality perspective. So we know what percentage of venture partners or decision makers are women. How many are women of color? How many are trans women? How many are women with XYZ experiences? I say Z because I'm from Canada. So I think there's a real opportunity in the deployment of capital to begin to look at how we adopt what I call a ready strategy. We know that Black women-led startups receive less than 0.006%. So I'm not even talking about less than 1%. It's less than half of 1% of tech funding from venture. And so we have an opportunity to, I think, Jessica, you really honed in on this, adopt more of an asset framing approach when it comes to investors and strategic corporate partners. They are sleeping on significant markets. They are missing opportunities. If you think about the purpose of a business, it is traditionally to maximize shareholder returns. If you think about the responsibilities, the fiduciary obligations of fund managers and those people that are entrusted from a legal standpoint and a functional standpoint, their job is also to maximize returns. And so we need to stop seeing this as a handout. We are leaving money on the table, and VCs are not meeting their fiduciary obligations if they're ignoring women. So when you look at the personal mobility devices industry, generates about $7.7 billion, I think, over the last year, and is projected to increase to about $14.5 billion by 2027. So it's a significant growth. We also know that women make up 66% of public transport users. Even if we look at the opportunity, that is huge. We are simply just leaving money on the table. And then when we look at the founder side, there's an opportunity for us to double down on significant leaks that we have in the pipeline. We know that the challenges that women experience, Candace and Regina and Jessica, you all spoke to this from individual anecdotes. We need to double down on those accelerators and incubators that are actually building a robust pipeline, not just of the capacity building support, but those networks. I think about Babson's WinLab that does have a presence here in Miami, but I also think about organizations like Springboard Enterprise, that's headquartered a little bit further north. They have created over 27 billion in value, supported 835 companies, like 89% of their companies raised capital, 22 IPOs, and 200 plus M&A events. There are mechanisms that are working. We're just not creating a cohesive pipeline from the founder through to the investor. We need to look at the ecosystem or the full spectrum of doubling down on being more inclusive.
Well, and by the way, Leanne, I mean, with MobilityXX, the way that we're looking at it is there is a true business case for this. So yes, there is an equity element of it, but there is a true business case, and there is proof that these approaches really do work from a business perspective. So those are really great statistics and examples that you brought forward. And in fact, we may ask you to send some of those over to us so that we can incorporate that and engage you in some of this discussion too for MobilityXX. So great comprehensive view. Thank you for sharing that. Jessica, I'd like to move to you next. So the statistics do show that VCs with female partners are delivering greater returns on their portfolios, and that includes startups that are led by women in the portfolios. Can you share what you're doing as a founder to affect that? And what are other ideas for how to expand women entrepreneurs' access to capital?
Yeah, thanks, Beth. I think, Leanne, you raised something really important in this question, which is the role of mentorship and access to capital. There's studies and headlines, women and people of color are over-mentored and undercapitalized, but it's tricky because there's also a saying, which is, if you want advice, ask for money, and if you want money, ask for advice. And so those more systematic approaches to pairing mentorship and advisory roles with a goal of creating access to pools of capital, I think is really an important next step there. I already mentioned being a woman co-founder with 2 male partners. We, as I said, we have these conversations all the time. And what I've seen is there's a favorite saying of mine that a dripping water hollows out stone, not by force, but by persistence. And I think we all can be mindful about when to be persistent and when to rattle some cages. And I sense a growing moment in time where we as women and allies of women in this space will start to rattle a few more cages. I think about California's mandate, for instance, around women's leadership on corporate boards. I do think we will see more of that. But maybe to bring it a little bit more close to home, and some of the things that I'm doing and we're doing is there's a group called Start Out, for instance. They support founders who are LGBTQ and may, for various reasons, again, lived experience or access, not even fully identify as an entrepreneur, and simply giving them the space and the support to say, no, you can actually create this business is really important. Many of them, though, have faced incredible sources of bias in trying to stand up their companies, maybe targeted at a particular subsector or population. So again, I think we can check our own bias and say, where else can I go and look to meet people who maybe do not have that same experience, and be very explicit about making those connections. Maybe instead of always sourcing from MIT, Stanford, Carnegie Mellon, we can go look at some of the HBCUs as well and see what kinds of companies are coming out of there. So I think that's step one, is being mindful. Step two is really being willing to walk down that path and have those conversations. Frankly, some days we're all tired of it, right? And we just wish that there were more joining, but it does take effort to build mindfulness in a movement. And I think just being willing to continue to persist on the importance of this is key. But as I said, rattle some cages. And that's where, when the MobilityXX team came up with this 10% goal, I thought it was a great suggestion.
Well, and it seems like it's true for everything when you're trying to affect change, that you really do have to be persistent. Mm-hmm. And keep the messaging going and try to continue to build, and eventually those changes begin to occur. I do want to mention to our audience that we're not going to have any more polling, so feel free to place your questions in the chat. There's several people that are part of this workshop, so we'd like to encourage you to do that. I'd like to move on to another question. It's a little bit different. So all of you are very passionate about this subject and have found ways to go above and beyond your day-to-day career activities to help women rise in this field. Based on your experiences, what are you actively doing to cultivate women in the industry, and what impact is it having? And this is real, I'm just putting this out there to all of you, and anyone who would like to chime in first, please do.
I'm happy to kind of get started. Well, I think that over the course of my career, especially having spent most of it in engineering where women were underrepresented, I've always been involved in organizations that really try to support women, provide a network for myself when I was an undergraduate in computer science. So organizations like the Society of Women Engineers, where there's built-in mentoring from professionals to college students to then actually organizing STEM activities, for grade schoolers. But as now an entrepreneur and being CEO of a startup, for me, what that looks like primarily is continuing to really seek out diverse investors where I can find diverse investors. And as we've seen from the statistics, they're harder to find, but I've sought them out. And then also in thinking about hiring and recruiting and making sure that we're reducing our own biases when we're recruiting as a company. I'm really proud that on our leadership team, my director of operations is female, my lead product manager is female, and I think we probably have more of a pipeline of women engineers that come into the company that are probably reflected in the industry, and that's important to me. And so I think that that's one of the key things that women entrepreneurs can do. I also am really hopeful, especially with a lot of the new energy and activity that we're seeing in the transportation ecosystem, and more recognition that we need to improve diversity, to be involved in initiatives like MobilityXX. So there's a lot to be done, both rattling cages and that persistent slow drip.
That's great, Regina, thank you. Leanne, did I see that you've unmuted?
Yes, I'll jump in. I'm also in the habit of getting into good trouble, and I'm never afraid to rattle a couple of cages. So, it's interesting, in 2019, we hosted a curated gathering that was focused on the more inclusive deployment of capital called Capital Days. Full day, invite-only experience, 50-50 ratio between investors and companies led by women and people of color. It's called Ready Founders that are really representative. And obviously due to COVID, didn't do it in 2020. And I think that for me, what we premised that experience on was trust and access. We know the data. We've explored the data ad nauseum here. We know there are inequities, and we know the solution is not just in regurgitating data. But what I realized is it's really, to Jessica's point, about connection and opportunities. How do you build your social capital? It's through intimacy, consistent intimate experiences over time. And it's also access to networks that are traditionally closed and impenetrable. And so taking the two pillars of trust and access, for me, that is kind of relaunching, now that we can get back together, into just a series of experiences and curated gatherings through the Alchemy Exchange, which is kind of open source. Nobody really owns it, but looking at three particular ways where we can solve some of these gaps. So one is just kind of a very simple database of ready founders that are looking for venture capital and opportunities. Myself and other people that are trying to make those connections, just putting in the founders that we vet and talk to so other people can search and more easily get to a crop of founders that they're looking to talk to. Secondly, this idea of salon series. People love a good brunch, but what if you had brunch plus knowledge exchange? So salon series that are looking at increasing knowledge in small curated groups. And lastly, what we realized at Capital Days is we hosted a series of dinners. We called it Dinner Deconstructed, where you were given an address, but you didn't know who was going to be there. And people hosted 6 to 8 individuals in their home, mix of investors and founders. And what we realized is those dinners were not about business. They were about creating those intimate exchanges where you really got to understand and know people. At my dinner table, there was about $2 billion worth of capital, assets under management or exits, just at my dinner table. And what we found is those types of curated experiences, when intentionally designed with the right people at the table, are what open up the watershed doors of opportunity. So for me, going through 2021 and beyond is really continuing that.
What great out of the box ideas, and it sounds like it's translated into outstanding results, Leanne. Thank you for sharing those with us. Who would like to speak next? I'm looking for an unmuted microphone. Jessica.
I'll jump in here. I think, Beth, the way I'd answer that is to remember we're not walking this journey alone. And for me, what that means is calling on those that have gone before and bringing along those that are still coming. And so for me, it's cultivating a group of advisors that have that experience. And, yes, that's maybe selfish and self-serving as we try and stand up our organization. But I think it's really important, Regina, you talked about that, right? That access to a network of people around you. We're all human. And sometimes we need that phone number to call on, or someone to say, hey, is this as screwed up as I think it is? And someone who's been there before say, yeah, that's, yeah. But also to remember that the path has been, the first path through the forest has been started to be carved for us. But I think in terms of bringing others along with us, one of the other organizations that I co-founded and still very involved with focuses on training and education in this space. And last summer, we piloted a program with Detroit youth to help underserved youth understand the science-based and engineering-based jobs in transportation, automotive a little bit more specifically. And we were very explicit in terms of who was recruited into that program, all youth of color, about half were young women, but we were even more explicit on the mentors and the panelists that we brought into the session so that youth could not just hear from someone like me, but people who grew up with very similar life experiences and understand how they made that transition and continue to focus on the pieces of learning that are important. And yes, maybe that's all extra work, but I think that, we do it out of passion, but as Leanne said, it's also a smart business case too. These are the founders that I still want to be able to invest in throughout the course of my career. And if we're not building that pipeline, shame on us.
Well, and you brought up something which is hearing from others who have had similar experiences and how they have handled them. Because that brings credibility when you are the receiver of that advice and information. They've walked in your shoes, they've been where you've been, they've tried different things, and here's what led them to success. And I think that's a wonderful approach. Thank you so much, Jessica, for all you're doing as well.
Thanks.
Candace, anything to add here?
Yes, I think everyone here covers a lot of great things, but I just want to echo one part is that understanding, I have a moment like understanding I wasn't alone. That moment was very powerful for me. So with that being said, is that I think we need to constantly search for a community. And when we're at a position, I think we need to help to build that community and speed up and give to others. So we can like stand strong and stand out just to empower the women together in the industry, which is super important.
Well, I think also to be able to pay it forward. When we've been the beneficiaries of some good advice that has really helped us, and those that have invested in us have been champions, it's really nice to do the same for others when we've seen success. And I think those are great points, Candace. So I think what I'd like to do, we're going to be wrapping up shortly. We've had some great dialogue here, and we have a number of folks who have been listening in, I'm sure, intently. I have been taking notes because it's just been such great information and advice being shared by all of you. So I think what I'd like to do right now is maybe let's kind of go around and ask each of you if you have any parting comments, and maybe what you could think about as you have a few seconds to think about, is there one bit of advice that you might have for a woman-led startup? And is there one bit of advice that you might have for a VC? Since even though you represent those different groups separately, you both have experiences with each other, obviously, we know from this conversation. So Leanne, would you mind if I started with you?
I was born ready.
I'm writing that down too.
Funny anecdote, I'm a trial lawyer by trade, and my law partner always said, when someone asks you to do something, your response should always be, I was born ready. And that actually brings me to the advice for women. Women-led organizations, startups, female founders, we have the tendency to shrink under pressure. When we're faced with an opportunity, we have a tendency to overthink, because that's how we're socialized. So it is what it is. But I encourage you to come with the answer that says, are you ready? I was born ready. Even if you don't have it all figured out, be bold, be courageous, and be willing just to meet the moment as you are. And as it relates to investors, I think that my advice would be, I want to say either Nike or Adidas or some sports company in the 90s or 2000s had a campaign that said, dare to be different. I would love for more women investors to be okay with daring to be different and not necessarily following that behavioral economics pattern that we see of herding, going with the grain. And so when you dare to be different, you can go against the grain, and it's okay. You don't have to maybe go to golf. I don't even play golf, but like, bring founders to the spa. Do things that you actually want to do. If it's like, rosé on Sundays, and talk about opportunities. So be okay with owning who you are, embracing your feminine energy and doing what you do best as a woman investor. And so that would be my advice.
Great advice, Leanne, and it sure sounds like a lot of fun too. So thank you very much for that. Regina, I'd like to go to you next. What are your parting comments here and advice?
Oh, so much good advice, Leanne. I was going to say everything that she said, and I'm obviously not an investor. I've worked as a founder, seeking funding from investors, but I do have a lot of investor friends. And one of the things that I find is interesting from female VCs is that sometimes they feel like they're not able to gain access to deals. There are all these conversations that are happening that they're unaware of. They're not invited to dinners from like the hot startup that everybody wants to get in a deal for. And so I would say, in addition to rosé on Sunday, which sounds lovely, you need to get in on the late night scotch nights too, and figure out how to get into those deals, because there are those closed conversations happening, and it's important to be aware of them. And to build a network and work within the system as well. For advice for female-led organizations, I think that for me, the thing that I took away from my experiences over the past decade is I really had the fortune to have had experiences at small stage startups before I started Populous. So I was part of a 30-person startup that was acquired by Daimler. They then acquired another company, and I saw how two organizations were merged under this large German auto conglomerate. And so for me, my advice for women who are interested in starting organizations is really to gain experience and learn from other people's mistakes before you have to make your own, because for me, that was extremely valuable.
Thank you, Regina. And by the way, we did get a question that came in. So if you don't mind, before we close out with Candace and Jessica, maybe we should go to this question first. So here's the question. Women represent less than 15% of the transportation industry. Top-down participation from decision makers to more women executives in companies is crucial to reduce the gender gap, but what about from the ground up? So it sounds like maybe this question relates to the responsibilities of those that are having these challenges. So how would you respond to that? And who would like to take the first opportunity to do that? Leanne, I see you're unmuted, so you were born ready.
Exactly. No, I've been thinking a lot about this because we often have a binary approach to creating opportunities for political capital or exercising power. And it's not mutually exclusive. You need to have both a top down and a bottom up and meeting in the middle. So folks at the top actually need to look at where their power and privilege is limiting feedback loops and limiting opportunities for mass participation, and also whether or not they're designing for what I call the lowest common denominator. We have to be able to think about gathering data, insights, and experiences from the users who are, again, most proximate to the challenges. And I think that starts by expanding who we have in our networks as partners to make sure that we're truly hearing from the ground. Very briefly, a quick anecdote is we are closing out what we're calling the Ready Scorecard, which is measuring the equity in South Florida's innovation and tech ecosystem. And we have 70 organizations that have partnered with us to distribute this quick 5-minute scorecard. But what's important is because we have a partnership network, we're able to get more diverse experiences, perspectives, and truly understand intersectional gaps. And so what I'd say to the answer to that question is, yes, we need more women at the top, definitely, but we also need to build those pipelines for communication and feedback loop through partnerships and understanding that just because we don't have the connection doesn't mean someone else doesn't.
Great, Leanne, thank you. Would anyone else like to chime in on that response? Leanne, you make it hard because you you really are, you have a tremendous amount of experience and you're very thorough in how you respond. Regina, I see that you have unmuted.
Yeah, the one thing that is part of a recent conversation that we had as part of MobilityXX that I recently started to fully appreciate is when you look at executives at the top of an organization and where they came from and their trajectory, one of the things that I've started to notice and want to encourage within Populace, and I think is important for women to kind of recognize as they're starting their careers, is what are the pathways that are leading people into those leadership positions. I find that there are certain functions and roles in organizations, including sales specifically, and engineering, where those pathways are critically important in a lot of companies, at least in the transportation technology space, in moving into those leadership positions. And so building that pipeline is incredibly important. I would say as a person who's actively recruiting, hiring constantly, we see a lot of need for more engineers. There just aren't enough engineers in the world to build the things that we need them to build. And so these programs that help you gain quick experience through coding boot camps, there are people who have liberal arts backgrounds who are churning through those programs, popping out on the other end, and anyone will hire them because there aren't enough engineers. And so I highly encourage anyone who's even contemplated, maybe that's a path for me, to go for it, because that will help, I think, build more technical leadership, especially as transportation as an industry becomes increasingly digital.
That's great, Regina. And actually, I do know of a few women actually that have been taking some initiative to really expose, particularly at the high school levels, young girls to STEM, and to see if that spark comes alive in them. And those that do that have been seeing quite a bit of success, by providing that exposure to them that they may not have had otherwise. So great points. Anybody else want to add to that? Okay, so we're going to go back to our closing remarks and our advice. Candace, I'm going to go to you next. I just want to remind you, just if you could close with a bit of advice, maybe one for women-led startups and one bit of advice for VCs.
Sounds good. Thank you so much for making it slightly easier for me not to leave me at the end. But first of all, I would say thank you so much, everyone. This is a very informational session. I do learn a lot from each one of you. So thanks a lot for sharing the information from your own sector that actually help everyone to broaden their viewpoint. So from my experience, I keep reflecting always like what we need to be successful in like mobility or in transportation. One thing is very interesting is that if everyone recall, when bike share started, the dockless bike share started like 4 years ago in US, that was a philosophy of grow with all costs, and everyone is raising the capital and want to be the biggest one who raising the highest amount and who can spend the highest amount as well. And when I started to pitch to people like several years ago, especially for the West Coast investor, they don't care about profitability at all. They felt like, are you joking? Saying profitability, where is your scale and where is your growth? So that, and I receive a lot of doubts, and also God knows how many no I receive also from the investor and also partners. But I still believe like transportation innovation takes years to build from private and public sector collaboration. And I have been pretty true to myself. And right now, I will see the conversation turn around. Everyone talks about profitability in the industry. And we are actually the one who is the first one able to achieve company-wide EB profitable in the industry, which we are also proud, and our city partner and riders appreciate as well. So all I'm trying to say is that no matter what kind of role you are, I think it's important to continue to be true to yourself, to your belief, and continuously to execute what you do. Speak up, execute, and give back to the community. And some of the patterns and some of the beliefs might be solid for a specific moment, but with the efforts we're doing, we're putting in to helping more women or helping in the industry, maybe after like 5 to even 100 years, things could change with our efforts.
Thank you very much, Candace. And I just want to mention that we did see that there's a member of our audience that would like to have the names of organizations that need engineers. So what we'll do is we'll ask CoMotion to please collect your information. We'll send it out to our panelists, and they can individually provide you with that information that they have. So I wanted to acknowledge that and let you know that we will do that. So Jessica, you get to round this out.
The final word. That's great.
Yeah.
I think my advice for VCs, fellow VCs, is two pieces. One is, if you're not looking deeply into mobility yet, you are missing out. It's only a small piece of so many investors' portfolio. And as someone who specializes in this industry, and of course everybody here today knows about the tremendous opportunities in this space, you'd be surprised how many people don't understand yet what it means to be part of creating technology that helps the world move. So if you're an investor and you're not looking at mobility, of course I'm biased, but I think you're missing out. So call me and let me tell you why I think this industry is the place to be. I think for actually both groups, let's check the data and then check ourselves and ask ourselves, where are we placing our time, where are we placing our capital? And is that, to Mian's point, really aligned with our fiduciary responsibility, whether that's as investors, as builders of companies, as funders of programs, and have that honest conversation with ourselves. And then I think for really anybody who's on this call, my last piece of advice would be share something that you learned today. That's really an opportunity to magnify the impact of programming like this, which CoMotion has been so thoughtful to include. So call somebody, tell them something you learned today, why you care, why you think this is important. And, at a minimum, we will instantly double the impact and the reach of this program today. But those things have a potential to catch like wildfire. So thanks, Beth, for leading this conversation today. I learned some new things as well.
Well, Jessica, thank you too for your closing remarks, which I think is great. So for those that have shared this with us, whatever you have learned, please share it with others where it could really have some meaning. I would like to take this opportunity to thank our panelists. I mean, you've just been amazing, not just in this dialogue today, but what you've achieved, your role models, you lead by example, and you provide opportunities for others to engage with you so that you can help pay it forward. And thank you for everything that you do. And it's really wonderful to be able to have you as part of this dialogue. I also want to thank CoMotion. Thank you, CoMotion, for recognizing that this was an important topic that was worthy of discussion. So we appreciate you for that, and also for pulling together a great conference. And I really have to thank a few other wonderful people. And I want to thank the team from ITS America, Laura Chase, the COO, Elizabeth Johnson, and Rachel Retberg. Elizabeth and Rachel are actually here online with us right now, in addition to kind of helping us behind the scenes to try to determine how to really bring forward some great dialogue. Elizabeth and Rachel have been behind the scenes helping move the presentation forward and making sure we could get those questions to you for the polling. And we just appreciate everything that they do. And also in conjunction with WTS International and the RAY, the three organizations having the foresight to really put MobilityXX forward so that we can really help to elevate women in our industry, the transportation industry. So thank you, everyone. Thank you to our audience who stayed tuned with us. And regardless of where you are in the country, I'd like to say have a great night tonight. Have a great closeout to your afternoon. And if there's anything more that you need or you'd like to engage in, please let CoMotion know, and they know how to find us. Have a great rest of your day, everyone.